So to wrap up with the Renaissance, the critical humanism that was a hallmark of that era had much to do with a nation's proximity to the church. And by the church, I mean capital C, the Church of Rome. The closer you were to Rome, the more likely Catholic dogma would overrule more secular interest in the human figure and the coming Reformation. And the Reformation is a direct result of people having individual inquiry into their faiths without the mediation of clergy. Now, the Reformation doesn't happen everywhere all at once, which makes it a little difficult to discern the exact beginnings and ends of these eras, but we're going to try and contextualize it a little better. The Protestant Reformation was a call that did not go unanswered. The Spanish Inquisition was one such answer, though a very militant one. On the heels of the Renaissance is a time of artistic expression known as international mannerism, where the ideas of the Renaissance are built upon, the questions are investigated, and this births one of two common responses: the growth of these ideas or the rejection, rebellion against them. The influence of these ideas is not limited to theater. They're very prevalent in the visual arts, the music, and the philosophy of this in-between time. Here's a good visual example of the evolution of ideas occurring at this time. Renaissance artists like Michelangelo would paint in exquisite detail the human subject, even in depicting scenes from the Bible. Bronzino takes the form and the method of the masters of the Renaissance and reapplies it to pagan tales with even more detail of the human form as a nude. This evolution of aesthetic makes some people stop and look back at Michelangelo and say, maybe we shouldn't have so many naked people on the walls of our churches. One facet of the Reformation. So various concerns and complaints with the way Catholic Church was run births several different Protestant sects around Europe. This map shows you the geographical landscape of the religion of Western Europe around 1550, the height of the Renaissance. Likely the most tangible result of the Counter-Reformation is the Catechism of the Council of Trent, where the Catholic hierarchy sat down and essentially established a handbook, a manual of sorts that explains the dogma of the Church and how people are meant to worship. Now, I've mentioned proximity to the Catholic Church being a factor in the way the timeline lays out, and it is nowhere more apparent than in England. Henry VIII's creation of the Anglican Church was one of the first official splits from the Church of Rome, and we know why he did that. Now, the Counter-Reformation in England is mostly associated with this individual, Oliver Cromwell. In some respects, this man is England's one-man version of the Spanish Inquisition. He deplored the worldliness of the Anglican Church as well as the royalty. He broke the heads off of statues, broke stained glass windows, and melted down the crown jewels while he was a self-appointed Lord Protector of the realm. Now, while Oliver Cromwell was getting his destruction on in England, France was diving headfirst into an era known as the Baroque. This is the time when Molière's Tartuffe was written and performed. This is also a time, unfortunately, when you begin to see elitism creating a schism in theater. It's not entertainment for the masses anymore. The same year as Molière's Tartuffe, Louis XIV moved the royal palace from the Louvre in Paris to Versailles outside of Paris. This is the penultimate example of conspicuous consumption. This palace was designed and maintained for the sole enjoyment of the royals and their invited guests. This is the infamous Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. And most of this was done at the behest of the monarch Louis XIV, or Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. In another example of conspicuous consumption, please notice the lining of his very long cloak. That is a fur known as ermine, which was, among sumptuary laws, reserved for use by royals only, because it takes one ermine each for each of those black spots. Louis XIV is also the ultimate example of a ruler who subscribed to absolutism. L'État, c'est moi, he said. The state is me. Another interesting thing going on at this time was the academic inquiry into the arts. This will have a great deal of influence on the writers and theorists of theater that we will read more about in the 19th and 20th centuries. Rationalism was another hallmark of the Baroque era, and this is building upon the inquiries of the Renaissance into the classics and laying the groundwork for the scientific revolutions to come. Now, as I mentioned, there is an unfortunate schism happening at this time. There's elite arts and there's bourgeois arts. The bourgeois are just this growing middle class. But they're a middle class that is now imbued with this Calvinist austerity. So here's the scorecard of how the religions have evened out during this era. At the end of the Counter-Reformation, we have Spain still very Catholic. France is still scoring a point for Catholicism, but also dabbling in this absolute, almost godlike power of their monarch, where Holland has this Calvinist Protestantism, nationalism, and individualism. That individualism even influences René Descartes. Though living in France, he is considered the father of modern philosophy for his "I think, therefore I am." Individualism and inquiry at its finest. This individual inquiry also translates very vividly into the visual arts. Here are two examples of Rembrandt's many self-portraits. The self-portrait could perhaps be as close as you can come to René Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." Rembrandt is also notable for delving into the realm of reproducible art, something the Chinese had been doing for a long time, but his etchings helped remove what is known as the cult of the artist, putting works of art into anyone's hand. The schism between the elite and the bourgeois continues even more rapidly in France. Here are some stills from a French film called Ridicule that depicts the story of a countryman going to Versailles, trying to garner support from the king to save his town from essentially flooding. At court, the game is wit, and the rules are that you must be quick and malicious, and that is one of the faults of the aristocracy that would fan the flames of a revolutionary spirit not too long from now. Here are some stills from the 1988 film Dangerous Liaisons, which not only depict immaculately the Rococo aesthetic of 18th century France, but also more of this flawed aristocracy that views marriage as simply an obstacle to be overcome if a challenge to an aristocrat's amusement. The 19th century is where things really start to get messy. The Industrial Revolution is cause for yet another great urban migration, with overpopulation in the cities and passions running high. Is it really any wonder that trouble is about to erupt? Your text references the theater riots when either prices are raised outside the realm of feasibility for the working class, or when they simply don't like the construction of the play. These passions demand answer, and that is the birth of Romanticism. Romanticism doesn't necessarily mean it's a romantic story of love, but it means that it's fueled by a passionate nature, one that cannot be held back by rules and structure. Now, the opposite of Romanticism, I would say, is the well-made play. Though this term becomes a pejorative by the end of the century to many of these scholars of theater, these theorists, the naturalism imbued in works like Ibsen's A Doll's House can be largely attributed, at least philosophically, to the scientific revolution and the realization that we know more about the natural world around us. We owe it to the natural world to depict it more accurately. Melodrama is a problematic term, as we've mentioned before, because its literal meaning just means that you have to have music. And that could be a musical, that could be an opera. The distinction between the two of those is also contentious. So we really mean that a melodrama is meant to use music to heighten the emotion of the situation, much more closely aligned with Romanticism than the well-made play. Though we are familiar, most of us from watching films, that there are certain conventions of music underscoring that will help bring either a sense of nature or a sense of emotion to a scene. As many of you did mention in the discussion boards when we discussed melodrama before, Jaws is an awesome example of how music is used to great effect to heighten that sense of anxiety, the sense of something about to happen. So hopefully this very quick tour through about 300 years worth of art and philosophy will help you contextualize the large amount of information that the text and I have thrown at you. I look forward to your discussion board posts this week, as well as reading your performance reports. And please keep in mind that our final exam is looming near, and it will be comprehensive. Email me if you have any questions.